The hemp is cool in your hands before the sun has properly reached the harbour, and the rope keeps a little of the night inside it, tucked between the twisted strands like damp air held in cloth. You sit on a low wooden bench near the open doorway, where the morning comes in grey and blue over the stones, and you begin to pick at the end with your thumb, loosening what the sea, the salt, and the hands of other men have made tight. The rope smells of tar, old water, dust, and work, and as you draw the fibers apart, slowly, steadily, you feel the roughness catch along the skin of your fingers, a familiar grain that tells you what kind of day it will be. Outside, Malta is waking in small sounds, not all at once, but in layers, with a cartwheel over the road, a shutter being lifted, a woman's voice from an upper window, and the soft slap of harbour water against stone. The air carries lime dust from the pale walls, coal smoke from a vessel lying at anchor, and that sour sweet smell of rope and pitch that seems to belong to dockyards everywhere, though here it mingles with warm rock, seaweed, and the faint dryness of the island itself. You don't hurry, because this work has never answered well to hurry, and because the rope will only come apart strand by strand, just as the morning will only open one shade of light at a time. You are a rope caulker in Malta in the early 1900s, working close to the Grand Harbour, where ships have come for centuries to be repaired, supplied, watched over, and sent away again. Some are little boats with patched sails and sun-browned men aboard, and some are larger vessels tied to the long quays, with iron fittings, painted names, and a complicated smell of steam, oil, wood, and salt. Your work belongs to the quiet spaces between their journeys, when a hull must be made sound, a deck seam must be sealed, or old rope must be turned into something useful once more, and the ordinary labour of hands keeps water where it belongs. The rope before you may once have been part of a mooring line, or a tackle fall, or some length taken from stores after too much wear, too much strain, or too much salt had made it unfit for its first purpose. It is not wasted, because rope is too full of labour to throw away casually, and because in a port town, almost everything has a second use, if someone knows how to coax it out. You tease the hemp apart into loose fibres, making oakum, the fluffy tarred material that can be driven into seams between planks, where it swells and grips and helps keep a boat dry enough for its next leaving. There is a rhythm to it that settles in the body after the first hour, as your fingers pull, separate, roll, and gather, while your shoulders learn how to remain low, and your back learns the shape of the bench. The rope is stubborn at first, especially where old tar has stiffened it into ridges. But once a few strands are freed, the rest begins to give with a muted rasp, like a dry whisper repeated over and over. The work leaves little curls of fibre on your apron, on the bench, and on the stone floor. And by mid-morning the place around your feet looks as though a small nest has been built from the tired remains of the sea. You have a knife nearby, though you don't use it much unless a knot must be opened or a hard lump must be cut away, because good oakum comes from patience more than force. You keep a spike too, worn smooth where fingers have held it, and sometimes you press it into a twist and lean just enough to persuade the rope to loosen without cutting the fibers too short. The tools are simple, almost plain enough to disappear into the hand, and after years of use they seem less like separate objects than extensions of the day itself, lying beside you with the calm trustworthiness of bread, water, and a door latch. In the harbour, bells mark time in a way that belongs to ships and churches together, and the hours pass without needing to be named too sharply. A caulker learns to hear small changes, the call of a foreman from farther down the yard, the hollow knock of a mallet on deck planking, the scrape of a ladder moved across stone, and the gulls turning their voices above the masts. Each sound comes through the doorway and settles around you, while your hands continue their own counting. Not in numbers exactly, but in lengths, softened, coils opened, and little bundles of oakum set aside. The job has two parts that are closely tied together, though. One may be done in shade, and the other on a vessel under a changing sky. First there is the preparation of the fibers, the undoing of rope into oakum, and then there is the caulking itself, when the oakum is driven into the seam with irons, and a mallet until the wood holds it firmly. In Malta, where the sun can harden paint, and the sea can find the smallest path inward, These small lines between planks matter very much, though they remain almost invisible when the work is finished well. When you step onto a boat to work the seams, the world changes under your feet, and even a vessel lying still beside the quay has a slow movement of its own. The deck smells warmer than the shop, with pitch softened by sun, wet wood drying near the scuppers, and sometimes fish, cargo, bilge water, or soap from recent washing. You kneel or crouch beside a seam, oakum tucked ready at your side, and you take up the caulking iron, which has a narrow edge made not for cutting but for pressing, guiding and setting the fibre into its hidden place. The mallet is often made of wood, heavy enough to speak clearly but not so harsh that it bruises the work beyond repair. Its sound is one of the old sounds of a harbour, a steady tuck, tuck, tuck along the line of a plank, softer than hammering iron and more measured than carpentry, because the seam must be filled evenly and not punished. You listen to the note as much as you watch the seam, and a practiced ear can tell when the oakum is seated well, when the space is too hungry, or when the next length must be rolled thinner between the palms. A rope caulker's hands are never quite clean in the way of a clerk's hands, because tar has a memory, and it settles in the creases, as though it intends to stay. In the early part of the day, your palms may be cool and stiff, but by noon they are warm, darkened, and roughened, with little fibres clinging to the skin and a smell that follows you even when you wash. This is not a disgrace, and it isn't something you think about very much, because every trade leaves its own mark, whether it is ink under a typesetter's nails, flour in a miller's cuffs, or the black cloth of tar on a caulker's thumb. The Malta of your working day is both island and workshop, limestone and empire, village sound and naval order, and you move through it with the modest knowledge of a person whose labour is needed but seldom praised. Around the harbour, the towns rise close together, with balconies looking over narrow streets, laundry hung in the light, children carrying errands, and steps worn shallow by generations of feet. From the yard you can see bastions, domes, cranes, spars and funnels, and it seems that every wall has absorbed the sound of rope, sailcloth, boots, bells, and water over hundreds of mornings. Some men in the yard repair engines, some plane timber, some paint hulls or carry coal, and some spend the day bending over things that no passenger will ever notice. You belong to the quiet company of those who work in seams, edges, lines, and hidden joinings. The people who make sure a thing holds together without drawing attention to themselves. There is comfort in that, not a grand comfort, but a low and steady one. Because the work is there, the tools are there, and by evening a vessel is a little more ready for the sea than it was at dawn. The old rope has its own history, though it will not tell it plainly, and sometimes, as you pick it apart, you imagine where it has been by the way it feels. A rope that has hauled cargo may be flattened in places and swollen in others, while a line that has known salt spray for many seasons may be brittle outside and softer within. There are bits of grit, paint dust, and sometimes a tiny fleck of rust caught inside the strands, and when they fall onto your apron, you notice them in the mild, passing way a person notices weather. Hemp rope in those days is made from plant fibre, twisted into yarns, yarns into strands, and strands into rope, each turn giving strength because many small things have been asked to hold together. When such rope is new, it has a pale colour and a dry, grassy smell, but on ships it is often treated with tar to resist rot, darkening it and giving it that deep, smoky scent that belongs to old rigging and repair yards. By the time it comes to you, it has already given service, and your work is not to restore its first life, but to draw from it a second, softer usefulness. The oakum you prepare must be neither too coarse nor too fine, because a seam asks for material with body enough to fill it and looseness enough to settle. If it is too lumpy, it won't bed properly, and if it is too weak and dusty, it may not hold the caulking compound or pitch as it should. So you feel it between your fingers, rolling a little length into a cord, pulling it back apart, and judging by touch what another person might try to measure by rule, though in this trade, touch can be more exact than a line marked on wood. By mid-morning, the sun has climbed onto the stone outside, and the doorway grows bright enough that the room behind you seems cooler by comparison. Someone passes with a tin mug of coffee, dark and sweet in the Maltese way, and the smell comes briefly over the tar and hemp, rich enough to make the mouth remember breakfast. You might have eaten bread with oil, or a little cheese, or something simple brought from home wrapped in cloth, and the day will carry on from these small provisions as much as from wages, orders, and the ship waiting alongside the quay. There are days when the wind comes from the sea and keeps the yard clean and moving, and there are days when it comes over the land and brings dust, heat, and the smell of streets. In winter, the damp can settle into the rope and into your cuffs, making everything a little heavier, while in summer the tar seems to wake and soften, sticking more readily to skin and cloth. You learn these shifts without needing to name them each time, because a worker's body becomes a quiet instrument, receiving season through the hands, knees, shoulders, and breath. When you work on the underside of a small boat drawn up for repair, the space narrows, and your world becomes planking, shadow, and the smell of old seawater. The hull curves above you like a darkened ceiling, and light enters in slanting strips, touching the caulking iron, the seam, and the small pile of fibre placed within reach. Each tap of the mallet echoes differently under there, not loud but close, and your breathing falls into time with it, so that the job becomes almost like sweeping, sewing, or rowing slowly across still water. The seam is opened just enough to receive the oakum, though not so much that the wood is harmed, and a good caulker respects the plank as much as the fibre. Wood moves with wet and dry, with sun and shadow, with age and strain, and the caulker works with that movement rather than against it. You drive the oakum in, set it, test it, and continue along the length, leaving behind a line that looks plain, almost modest, because the best repair is often the one that seems to have always been there. Sometimes the boat belongs to a fisherman from one of the harbour towns, and he stands nearby, watching without appearing to watch, because the condition of the hull is the condition of his working life. He may talk about the weather, or the price of fish, or say nothing at all, leaning against the wall with folded arms while you move along the seam. You know that he knows the sea in another way, by currents, nets, dawn departures, and the patience of waiting, and there is a quiet respect between trades that both depend on water behaving only as water does. Other days, the vessel is tied to a larger system of schedules, stores, uniforms, and official voices, because Malta's harbour in the early 20th century is a busy place for naval and merchant shipping. The British presence is part of the background of work, with dockyard rules, supervisors, ships under command, and materials that pass through accounts before they pass into hands. Yet beneath all that arrangement, the actual seam still asks the same question it asked of wooden boats long before paperwork and steam whistles, which is whether the space between planks has been filled with care. You may hear languages moving around you in the yard, Maltese first and closest, then English from officers and clerks, Italian words in conversation, and the mixed vocabulary of trade that grows wherever ships meet stone. Names of tools and materials travel easily, sometimes changing shape as they pass from one mouth to another, and a worker learns what is meant by gesture, tone, and the object being pointed at. The harbour is a place of arrivals, but it is also a place of repeated actions, and the same few words for rope, tar, seam, plank, and mallet become as familiar as the weathered walls. The work does not require much speech once it has begun, and that silence is one of its deepest textures. Beside you, another caulker may be tapping along a parallel seam, his mallet falling just before or just after yours, so that the two rhythms overlap without quite matching. Farther away, a saw starts and stops, a chain is dragged, a foreman's voice lifts and fades, and the harbour keeps its own low accompaniment. Water shifting in the basin, lines creaking, and gulls calling as though from a room just beyond sight. At times, you pause to stretch your fingers, because picking rope and driving oakum ask for different strengths, one close and fibrous, the other measured through wrist and arm. You look down at the line of work already done, and there is a gentle satisfaction in seeing a seam made orderly by many small, patient motions. It isn't the satisfaction of finishing a grand object or of signing your name, but something quieter and perhaps more durable, the sense that one necessary thing has been done well enough to vanish into use. The caulking compound, or pitch, comes after the oakum, sealing the surface and protecting the fibres within. It may be heated, softened, spread, or pressed, depending on the vessel and the material at hand, and the smell rises thick and dark when warmth touches it. On a hot day, the scent can fill the air around the boat until even lunch tastes faintly of tar, and later, when you walk home through streets of pale stone, you may still carry the yard with you like an invisible coat. Lunch is not a ceremony, but a resting of the body inside the workday, often taken in shade, where there is a wall, a stack of timber, or the side of a building to lean against. Bread comes out, perhaps olives, cheese, a tomato, or something cooked at home and wrapped carefully for the hours away. And talk moves slowly because no one wants to spend more energy than the day requires. You watch the harbour while you eat, and the ships seem almost still. The ropes tighten and slacken, smoke drifts, and small boats cross the water with the patient purpose of errands. There is a kind of companionship in eating near other workers without needing to speak much. Someone brushes fibers from his sleeves. Someone rinses his hands. Someone squints toward the sun and makes a remark about heat or rain. And then the remark settles into the general murmur of the yard. The day has not stopped, only widened for a moment, and when the meal is done, the body returns to its task as a hand returns to a familiar handle in the dark. In the early afternoon, the light becomes stronger, flattening shadows and making the limestone glare softly, so that even the sea seems to hold brightness under its surface. If you are indoors preparing oakum, the open door frames a rectangle of almost white light, and every loose fiber floating in the air becomes visible for a second before it disappears again. You work more slowly then, not from laziness, but from the sensible economy of people who live in warm places, giving the body enough pace to continue without fighting the heat. The rope in your lap is shorter now, reduced from a thick length into a loose pile of tarred fiber, and you gather the oakum into bundles that can be carried where they are needed. The bundles are light but not clean, and when pressed together they hold the dark smell of their former life, part plant, part smoke, part sea. Each one may disappear into a scene before the day ends, and that is the strange, quiet fate of your work. To make something by undoing something else, and then to hide what you've made where only water would look for it. A younger worker may sit nearby, learning the feel of the rope, and you can tell by the way he pulls too sharply that his hands have not yet learned patience. You show him without many words, taking the end, loosening the twist, and drawing the fibers back in a slow, even motion, so that the strand opens instead of breaking. He watches your thumbs more than your face, because trades are often taught through gestures, and a good movement can carry more instruction than a long explanation. You remember being new yourself, though the memory comes not as a clear picture, but as a feeling in the fingers, a time when every tool seemed separate and every mistake seemed louder than it was. The older men then had corrected you gently or sharply according to their nature, but the rope had corrected you most of all, refusing to behave when pulled badly, and yielding when approached with the right firmness. Over time, the body learned what the mind could not hold all at once, and the job became less like an order and more like a conversation carried through material. There are many kinds of caulking in the working world, and the word can belong to houses, barrels, ships, and seams of different sorts, but here by the harbour it means keeping water from entering where wood meets wood. The sea is patient, and it doesn't need a wide opening. It only needs a path, a hairline, a neglected place, a small absence repeated with every lift and fall of the hull. So your labour is patient too, answering the sea in its own language of repetition, not with force or drama, but with fibre, pitch, wood, and time. Some seams are easy, clean, and regular, especially on newer work where the planks still hold their shape and the space is fair. Others are awkward, old, widened, narrowed, or interrupted by fastenings, repairs, and the history of previous hands, and these require a slower judgment. You might change the thickness of the oakum, angle the iron differently, or pass once and then again, making sure the seam receives enough without becoming strained, because too little work leaks, and too much work can harm the very thing it means to protect. The caulking iron has several forms, and a caulker may keep more than one, choosing by width, curve, or the nature of the seam. Some are for making a beginning, some for setting, some for finishing, and each has a particular face worn by repeated blows from the mallet. When you lift one and feel its balance, you know it by weight and by the polished places where hand and use have made it personal, though it may have been forged without any thought of affection. In the shop, tools are put down in expected places, not from tidiness alone, but because repeated work depends on small certainties. The knife near the bench, the spike within reach, the coil by the wall, the mallet beside the oakum, the rag for wiping tar from fingers, all these are part of the day's quiet map. When a tool is missing, the whole rhythm catches, and for a moment the worker feels the absence the way the tongue feels a missing tooth. Not with alarm, just with a persistent small awareness. Sometimes rain comes, and in Malta it can arrive with a suddenness that changes the yard without changing the work entirely. Men lift materials under cover. Voices move faster for a few minutes, and the smell of wet dust rises from the stone, warm and mineral, as if the island itself has taken a breath. If you are beneath shelter with rope to pick, the rain becomes company, tapping roofs and darkening the threshold, while your hands continue in the same old way, drawing use out of worn hemp. On such a day, the harbour loses its hard brightness, and the ships become softer shapes behind the rain, their masts and funnels fading into grey air. Water runs along gutters, drops from balcony edges, and gathers in shallow places on the quay, where it reflects a rope, a boot, or a passing cart for a moment before being disturbed. The caulker's trade feels especially sensible in rain, because every drop reminds you what a small opening can invite, and why seams deserve the patient attention they receive. In dry weather, the concern is different, because wood can shrink, seams can open, and a vessel that seemed tight in one season may ask for work in another. The caulker learns not to blame the boat for changing, because everything made from living material keeps some memory of movement. Even old planks, painted and fastened, remain responsive in their quiet way, swelling when wet, easing when dry, and asking the hands that maintain them to understand change without making a fuss about it. There are records in offices, certainly, and orders written down, and stores counted, and names entered in ledgers, but your truest record is along the line of the seam. It shows where you began, where the fibre settled well, where the plank was worn, where the pitch smoothed evenly, and where a little extra care was needed. No, one may read it in that way except another worker, and even he may not say anything, because recognition in a yard often comes as a nod, a glance, or the absence of complaint. The sound of caulking can be heard from a distance once you know it, and it differs from the sharper strike of metalwork or the broader thud of heavy carpentry. It is a compact sound, close to the wood, repeated with small variations as the seam changes under the tool. In the old harbour towns, a person might pass a repair yard and hear that steady tapping without looking in, and somewhere in the mind the sound would join other local sounds: church bells, hooves, voices, water, and the soft clatter of domestic life from open windows. By late afternoon, shadows begin to return to the yard, lengthening from walls, boats, ladders, and stacked timber. The light warms and lowers, touching the edges of things rather than flattening them, and the whole harbour seems to breathe out after the glare of midday. You may be tired by then, not with a single dramatic ache, but with many small fatigues gathered across the body, fingers roughened, knees aware of kneeling, shoulders carrying the memory of each measured blow. Still, there is usually one more length to finish, one more bundle to prepare, or one more seam to inspect before tools can be put away. You move along the last section with the careful pace that tired workers know well, because the end of the day is not the place to become careless. The seam doesn't know that your arms are heavy, and the water will not be kinder because the hour is late. So you give the last part its proper attention, as you gave the first. When the oakum is set and the surface is sealed, you wipe the edge, clear the loose fibres, and look over the work from a little distance. A completed seam has a quiet neatness, a narrow dark line against the planking, modest and functional, with no flourish beyond the steadiness of its making. You may run a finger near it, not over fresh pitch but along the neighbouring wood, and in that small inspection there is the deep calm of a thing done in the old manner. The boat will not thank you, of course, and neither will the sea, and perhaps the owner will only nod before turning to some other matter of sails, nets, cargo, or accounts. That is enough. Many useful jobs live in that kind of enough, where the reward is partly wages, partly habit, and partly the knowledge that a hidden place has been made sound by your own two hands. As evening approaches, the harbour changes its colours again, and the pale stone of Malta gathers honey, rose, and grey in its surfaces. Voices become softer or more distinct, depending on the street, and the air cools in little threads that move through doorways and along the water. You collect the remaining oakum, coil what rope is left, wipe the tools, and place them where morning will find them, because tomorrow's ease is often prepared in the last minutes of today. The bench is brushed clear, though it will never be entirely free of fibre, and the floor holds the marks of labour in dust, tar specks, and the faint shadow of where your boots have rested. A rag dark with pitch is folded and set aside, the mallet is put down with its worn face turned inward, and the knife returns to the place where your hand expects it. These gestures are small, but they close the working day as surely as a door closes a room, and they tell the body that it may begin to loosen. When you step outside, the air feels different on your hands, and the harbour opens in front of you with a breadth that the workshop did not have. Ships remain at their moorings, ropes lead from bollards to decks, and somewhere a lamp is being lit as the sky lowers into evening. You carry home the smell of hemp and tar, and even after washing, a little of it stays, not unpleasantly, but like a trace of the day preserved in the skin. The walk home may take you through narrow streets where the stones still hold the day's warmth, and where voices come from kitchens, doorways, and balconies above. Someone is cooking, someone is calling a child indoors, someone is drawing water or folding cloth, and the ordinary life of the town gathers around you without ceremony. You are not separate from it, even though your day has been spent among boats and rope, because the harbour feeds the streets, and the streets send their hands back to the harbour each morning. At home, the work leaves you slowly. Your fingers may still make small movements without thinking, thumb against forefinger, as if testing fibre that is no longer there, and your hearing may still hold the echo of the mallet in the quiet between household sounds. The body keeps a faint rhythm after long repetition, and sometimes, just before sleep, the mind returns to a seam, a strand, a narrow line of oakum disappearing under the iron, and the motion is so familiar that it becomes almost restful. Tomorrow, the rope will be waiting again, perhaps a different coil, darker or lighter, wetter or more stubborn, carrying some other history of strain and weather. The harbour will wake in its layered way, the walls will brighten, the tools will come back into the hand, and the slow work of making vessels sound will continue without announcement. There is comfort in that return, in the knowledge that the world is held together not only by grand designs and visible achievements, but also by repeated, humble acts that fill the gaps and keep the water out. And as the night settles over Malta, the repaired seams lie quiet in the dark, holding their fibres, holding their pitch, holding against the small movements of the harbour. The boats shift gently at their lines, the stone steps cool, and the old rope, undone and remade, rests hidden between planks where no one will see it unless something has gone wrong. For now, nothing asks to be seen and nothing asks to be hurried, and the work of your hands remains there in the darkness, patient, ordinary, and complete. By the next morning, the bench has taken the coolness of the room again, and when you sit, the wood feels firm beneath you, polished by many shifts and many quiet bodies. A coil of old rope waits beside your foot, dark at the surface and pale where a broken strand has opened, and it seems almost to breathe the harbour back into the shop. You draw it across your lap with both hands, feeling the stiffness of salt and tar, and the first pull of the day begins with that small resistance that asks you to be patient. The doorway looks toward a lane where the light arrives slowly between limestone walls, and a strip of sky above the roofs turns from pewter to a mild washed blue. Someone nearby is sweeping stone with a reed broom, and the sound is dry and even, brushing dust toward the gutter, while the harbour below gathers its voices. You listen without turning your head, because the work in your lap is already enough to hold you, and because a caulker learns to let the world move around him while the fingers stay faithful to one strand at a time. At first, your hands are not quite awake, and the rope feels larger than it did yesterday, as though the night has tightened every twist. You work at the end with a spike, easing apart the three main strands, then drawing smaller yarns loose until the rope begins to forget its old shape. The fibers catch in little hooks and snags, and sometimes a hardened seam of tar must be bent back and forth until it loosens with a faint crackle, like dry kindling in the hand. There is no single motion that solves a rope, only a family of motions repeated so often that they become the grammar of the trade. You pull gently, then roll, then separate, then shake loose a wisp of fiber, and when the strand resists, you turn it a little, as if listening for the direction in which it wants to open. The oakum gathers slowly, and each small tuft keeps a shadow of the twist it came from, so that even undone material remembers the discipline of having once been rope. Outside, a mule cart goes by, and its iron-rimmed wheels make a hollow clatter over the uneven road, softened by the distance and by the thick walls of the workshop. A boy calls to someone from the corner. A shutter slaps once in a light gust, and the smell of bread from a nearby oven slips briefly into the room before the stronger smells of hemp and tar close around it again. The morning does not hurry past these things, and neither do you, because a Maltese working day near the harbour is made from such overlapping currents of trade, family, stone, water, and food. When enough oakum has gathered, you lift it in your palms and draw it into a loose rope of its own, softer and more uneven than the one it came from. It must be handled carefully, because it is meant to be pushed into narrow places, not spun into beauty, and its value lies in its rough willingness to spread and hold. You place it with the others, in a shallow crate darkened by years of use, and the crate becomes a little mound of prepared fibre, humble as straw, and yet necessary to the floating lives of boats. There are mornings when the work is all preparation, and the body settles into a seated quiet, knees apart, elbows loose, hands moving steadily over the lap. On those days, time becomes hard to measure, not because it has disappeared, but because it has been divided into such small, repeated acts that the clock seems less truthful than the pile growing at your side. The shop may be plain, with a table, hooks, coils, rags, and tools along the wall, but after an hour it feels complete, as if the whole world has narrowed kindly to fibre, light, and breath. A foreman may come to the door and ask for oakum for a deck seam on a lighter, or for a small fishing boat hauled up near the water. He doesn't need to say much, because the kind of work is often visible in the way he points, or in the width he shows between thumb and finger. You nod, gather the amount in a cloth, and rise carefully, because after sitting close to the bench your knees feel the return to standing, as a tide feels the pull of the moon. The walk down to the vessel takes you past stacked timber, coils of newer rope, barrels, paint tins, and men whose trades pass yours in brief, familiar glances. There is a cooper tightening a hoop, a carpenter sighting along a plank, and a painter stirring a pot with slow attention while flecks of colour cling to his cuff. Each trade has its smell and sound, and together they make the harbour yard into a long, low chorus that is never arranged but somehow always in tune with itself. The boat waiting for you is small enough that you can understand her at a glance, though not so small that she asks for careless work. Her planks have the weathered look of honest use, sun on the upper edges, darker wet marks lower down, and scratches where cargo, nets, or tools have passed over her. She rests against blocks near the quay, held steady for repair, and beneath her curve the shade is cool, close, and full of the damp wooden smell that belongs to boats when they are out of water but not yet dry. You kneel beside the seam and lay the oakum within reach, then choose an iron that suits the width, narrow enough to guide but not so sharp that it cuts. The first tap is light, almost a question, and the second gives the answer, showing how much space the seam will take and how firmly the old planks are holding. Then the work begins, its soft patterned fibre laid, iron placed, mallet lifted, blow given, and the line moves forward in a measured pace that belongs neither to speech nor to silence. A person passing by might think the caulker's rhythm is simple, but inside it there are many small decisions, each one made almost before it is named. The oakum must be firm but not jammed, deep but not lost, continuous but not thickened into lumps, and the mallet must fall with a steadiness that respects both fiber and wood. Your wrist learns to soften the blow at the end of a tight patch, and your fingers learn how much oakum to pinch for the next section, while the body remains folded close to the boat, like someone listening at a door. The owner stands nearby for part of the morning, his cap low, his hands clasped behind his back, and he watches the seam without interfering. He knows the places where the boat has wept water after a long day out, and perhaps he has marked them in his mind through many returns, noticing where the bilge grew damp, where a plank seemed tired, where a little dark line widened. You don't need the full account, only the scene before you, though his quiet presence gives the work a human weight beyond the material itself. When the sun reaches the side of the boat, the shade moves, and you shift with it, taking the tools a little farther along without breaking the rhythm. Dust clings to the dampness on your forearms, and a loose thread from your shirt catches a grain of tar, making a tiny dark knot that will probably remain there until washing day. These small inconveniences are part of the trade, accepted without much thought, because every kind of work asks the body to carry some sign of where it has been. A caulker's clothing is chosen less for appearance than endurance, and old cloth is often best because it has already learned the shape of labor. The sleeves are rolled or tied, the apron or trousers hold the marks of pitch, and the pockets collect twine ends, grit, and little unplanned bits of fiber that turn up later at home. Even the shoes take the work into themselves, gathering dock dust in the seams, polish from stone steps, and the faint dampness of yards where water is always near. By midday, the seam has taken a good length of oakum, and the line behind you is ready for sealing once the setting is judged sound. The surface is brushed and cleared, not with fussiness, but with the calm precision of someone preparing a bed for the last blanket. Pitch or compound will close the work from above, but what matters most is already hidden, because the strength of the repair lies beneath the dark line, where fiber sits in pressure, quietly waiting to swell. The heating of pitch belongs to another slow corner of the day, with a small pot, a careful flame, and the smell deepening as the material softens. It must not be treated wildly, because overheated pitch becomes troublesome, and underwarmed pitch refuses to spread with the same willing smoothness. So the worker watches, stirs, waits, and tests, letting the dark substance loosen into use, while the air around the pot grows thick with a smoky sweetness that seems to settle on wood, cloth, and hair. When the pitch is ready, it is carried with care, and the seam receives it in a narrow, shining line. The surface changes as it cools, gloss giving way to a duller skin, and the fresh work begins to look less like an action and more like a part of the boat itself. The owner may step closer then, not to praise, exactly, but to look, and you can see in his face the mild relief of a man who recognizes that one small worry has been put back into order. In the afternoon, another task may call you indoors again, where old rope waits in coils like sleeping animals, each one heavy with the memory of service. Some pieces have been cut from ship stores and are coarse, thick, and dark, while others are lighter lines from smaller craft, easier to open but less generous in fiber. You sort them by feel, judging which will make good oakum and which is too weak, too dirty, or too far gone. And this sorting is a kind of reading without words. Rope carries the marks of its making, and in Malta you may have seen rope walks where long, straight spaces allow fibers to be twisted into lines that can serve ships, carts, wells, and households. In such places, men walk backward with steady steps, turning fiber into yarn, yarn into strand, and strand into rope, while the length stretches out in front of them like a road being made by hand. The caulker receives the rope at the far end of that story, after use has aged it, and then gently returns it to fiber, as if closing a circle that began in a field far from the harbour. Not all hemp comes from the island, of course, because Malta's strength has long been in harbours, stores, passage, and the mingling of goods that arrive by sea. The fibre may have travelled farther than the men who handle it, crossing distances inside bales, ropes, cargo holds, and ledgers before ending up beneath your fingers on a shaded bench. But by the time you work it, its wider journey becomes less present than its immediate texture, the tug, the smell, the dark dust, and the yielding twist under your thumb. There is a modest thrift in the work that feels almost domestic, like mending a sleeve, saving candle ends, or turning yesterday's bread into something useful again. The harbour may be full of large movements, with ships entering, cargo shifting, and officials recording what comes and goes, yet your task begins with the refusal to waste what can still serve. Old rope becomes oakum, oakum becomes a seam becomes dryness inside a hull, and dryness becomes one more quiet condition for labour to continue. Sometimes, while the hands work, thoughts move through the day in the slow way they do during repeated tasks. You may think of a child needing shoes, a saint's feast approaching, a neighbour's news, the price of oil, or whether rain will come before washing dries on the line. These thoughts do not interrupt the work, because the fingers have their own wisdom, and the mind is allowed to wander gently as long as the material is treated with respect. The workshop itself has its own seasons of sound, and in the early afternoon it may grow drowsy, with voices lowered and the air thickened by heat. Flies move near the doorway, sunlight lies flat on the threshold, and somewhere beyond the wall a hammer rises and falls more slowly than it did in the morning. You pick the rope in that warm stillness, and each fibre drawn free seems to lengthen the hour, making the day feel wide, slow, and almost suspended above the harbour. Yet even in stillness, there is work being done everywhere, because a port never truly rests while vessels remain tied to its stones. A clerk bends over entries in an office, a woman carries food toward a husband or son in the yard, a sailor coils a line on deck, and a boy sent on an errand waits respectfully near a doorway until someone notices him. The caulker's place among these lives is neither high nor low in any dramatic sense, only part of the shared arrangement by which ships are made ready and households are kept. If you have worked many years, you can tell the age of a tool by the way it has changed shape through use, not only by rust or repair, but by the softening of its sharp certainties. A mallet handle becomes darker where the palm closes, an iron head spreads slightly under thousands of blows, and a spike gains a shine at the places where it enters the rope. These signs are quiet records, and when you lift an old tool, you are touching not only your own labour, but the labour of others whose hands have warmed the same wood. There may be tools inherited from a father, an uncle, or an older worker who no longer comes to the yard. Such tools carry no ceremony in daily use, because sentiment must give way to work, yet a man knows when a handle has been shaped by someone familiar. The tool doesn't speak of that person, but it sits in the palm with a remembered fit, and sometimes, during a slow hour, the hand recognizes a past life before the mind does. The younger men often want to be quick, because speed looks like skill from a distance, especially to someone eager to prove that his hands are no longer new. You let them try, and then you let the rope show them what rough haste produces: broken fibers, uneven bundles, or a seam that eats too much material in one place and not enough in another. After that, they may listen more kindly to the old advice, which is rarely grand and usually sounds like less, not more, less force, less hurry, less pride in the blow. A good caulker's pace can seem almost lazy to someone who doesn't understand what is being protected, but a slow hand may be the most economical hand because it prevents rework, saves material, and leaves the planks in peace. The trade teaches a person that haste can be expensive in quiet ways, and that a seam treated carefully the first time may spare many buckets of bailing, many curses, and many hours of later trouble. Now and then a vessel arrives with seams that show the habits of another place, another yard, or another man's hand. You see how the oakum was driven, how pitch was finished, how plank edges were treated, and from these traces you imagine work done under different light, perhaps in Sicily, Alexandria, Gibraltar, or some smaller port whose name you know only through sailors. The harbour makes neighbours of distant hands, and the seam beneath your iron becomes a meeting place for methods that have travelled without ever being written down. Malta itself has always been a place where materials arrive marked by other climates, and then are adapted to the island's own heat, salt, and stone. Wood may come from elsewhere, fibre from elsewhere, metal from elsewhere. Yet once they are used in the harbour, they take on a Maltese layer of dust, sun, and handling, The caulker's work belongs to this practical transformation, accepting whatever has come by sea and asking it to serve here, under this sky, beside this water, in this patient harbour. In the cooler months, the morning may begin with a shawl or jacket, kept close until the first hour of work warms the fingers. The stones hold dampness then, and the harbour sounds carry differently, clearer perhaps with each call and knock travelling across air that has not yet softened in the heat. Rope can feel harder in that season, less willing at first, and the tar may hold its stiffness until the room warms. So you begin more slowly, letting both hands and material come awake together. In summer, the difficulty is not stiffness but persistence, because heat sits in the walls, in the ground, and in the dark surfaces of tools. You keep water nearby, wipe your forehead with the back of your wrist, and choose shade with the instinctive care of someone who knows that shade is not idleness, but preservation. The work continues, but it takes on the island's summer rhythm, a little slower, a little deeper, and full of the bright silence that comes when the sun is overhead. On some days, the wind carries church bells across the harbour, and their sound folds gently into the yard without stopping anything. Men may glance toward the town, or not, depending on the task, and the bells pass over tools, vessels, ledges, roofs, and water with the same unhurried authority. For you, the sound marks not a break but a widening of awareness, reminding you that the same hour is being lived in kitchens, chapels, shops, and boats, while your hands continue to draw fibre from rope. There is a kindness in work that can be resumed after interruption, because not every task permits the mind to return so easily. If someone calls your name, or a cart must pass, or a supervisor asks about a repair, the rope remains in your lap exactly as it was, waiting without complaint. You answer, shift, stand, lift, or listen, and then you return to the strand, finding the old point of entry again with the small pleasure of a person returning to a remembered path. The caulker's bench may stand near other benches, and although each man has his own pile of rope or fibre, the shared room creates a woven quiet of its own. One man hums under his breath, another clears his throat, another turns a coil with a grunt, and someone near the door makes a remark about a ship's paint or a neighbour's wedding. The talk comes and goes like a light breeze, never needing to fill every space because the work itself provides enough continuity to hold the room together. As the afternoon settles, the rope in your hands becomes more familiar, and you begin to know its stubborn places before they arrive. A section hard with old tar will need bending, a frayed patch will open easily but produce shorter fibres, and a knot will take time, though perhaps not as much as it first pretends. You meet each part as it comes, without impatience, because the rope is not one thing but many small conditions twisted into the appearance of one line. That lesson belongs to much of working life, though it is taught here in hemp and tar rather than in spoken instruction. A boat is not one thing either, but planks, fastenings, seams, paint, bilge, mast, rope, and the hands that know how each part behaves. A town is the same, and a harbour too, made from stones, rules, weather, languages, trades, appetites, and the countless small routines by which people keep themselves fed and sheltered. At the end of a long rope, the last fibres can be the most troublesome because there is less length to grip and less order left in the twist. You take care not to waste them, gathering what is still useful, shaking free dust and grit, and setting aside the bits too dirty or brittle for a sound seam. The small leftovers collect in a corner, and even they may have some lesser use, because in a working yard, material descends through purposes gradually, like water finding lower channels. Your hands learn to separate usefulness from mere remainder, and that judgment becomes almost moral in its quiet way. Not everything can be saved, and not everything should be trusted inside a seam, but much can serve if placed where its strength is equal to the task. The caulker's thrift is not sentimentality. It is clear-eyed care, the kind that sees material honestly and gives it neither too little respect nor too much. When the light shifts toward evening, the room becomes cooler at the edges, and the open door frames workers returning from different parts of the yard. Boots sound on stone. A man laughs softly at something said behind him, and the day's accumulated dust seems to rise and settle again as people pass. You finish the length in your lap, roll the last good fiber between your palms, and place it with the rest, adding one more small contribution to the supply that tomorrow's seams may ask for. There is a way of cleaning up that belongs to tired hands, neither careless nor fussy, simply practiced. Loose fibers are swept into a pile, tools are wiped enough to be ready, the crate is moved away from damp, and the coil that remains is set where no one will stumble in the morning. Each motion has been done so many times that it requires little thought, and in that ease there is a mild dignity, as if the workshop itself trusts you to close the day properly. Before leaving, you may look once toward the harbour, not with the gaze of a visitor, but with the brief checking glance of someone whose life is tied to its moves. The water has darkened, the boats have become silhouettes, and lamps begin to appear one by one, small warm points against stone and rigging. Somewhere out there, a seam you worked lies below a deck or along a hull, out of sight and already part of the vessel's sleeping strength. Your body carries the day home again, and not only in weariness. It carries the seated posture of the bench, the kneel beside the hull, the small twist of the wrist, the measured fall of the mallet, and the tacky trace of pitch near the nail of one finger. Work enters the body by repetition, and then the body carries it gently into evening, where ordinary domestic things receive it without surprise. At home, a basin of water takes the surface dirt, but not the deepest smell, and soap lifts what it can from the lines of the palms. The water clouds. The rag darkens, and your hands emerge cleaner, but still marked, with roughened skin that tells the household exactly where the day was spent. This is common enough that no one comments unless a splinter needs attention, or unless a child asks about the blackness under a nail with the honest curiosity of small eyes. Supper is simple, and the appetite after harbour work has its own plain gratitude. Bread breaks, oil shines, a spoon moves through soup or stew, and the talk around the table rises and falls with the gentle tiredness of people gathering themselves after separate labours. You may speak of the weather, a vessel in repair, a man met in the yard, or nothing much at all, because the day has already been long enough, and not every thought needs words. Later, when the street grows quieter, the harbour is still present though you are away from it. A distant sound may reach the house, a horn, a bell, a cart, or the faint voice of men by the water, and in the mind it joins the remembered tapping of the mallet. Sleep comes not as an escape from the work, but as its companion, softening the hands that will work again, cooling the thoughts that have moved all day through rope, seam, pitch, and wood. And in the darkness of the yard, the tools rest where you left them, plain and silent on the bench or against the wall. The rope waits without impatience, the Oakum sits in its crate, and the boats at the quay shift gently as lines creak and water touches their sides. Nothing in that resting place is grand, and yet everything is held in readiness, as if the whole harbour has drawn one long breath and kept it quietly until morning. Morning returns first, as a pale edge along the upper stones, then as a softening in the air, and finally as the familiar summons of footsteps outside the door. Before anyone speaks, the workshop has already begun to wake, with dust showing itself in the first light, and the old coils taking on shape from the grey. You arrive with the ordinary quiet of a man entering a place he knows well, and your hand finds the latch, the bench, the tool shelf, and the waiting rope without needing much thought. The first task is not always the same, though it often feels as if it has been waiting from the day before. Sometimes a boat has opened a seam after drying too long on the slip, and sometimes there is only the slow preparation of oakum, which must be made before anyone can ask for it in a hurry. You take off your cap, set down your parcel, and look over the room with that practical glance workers give to the morning, seeing what is ready, what is missing, and what must be done before the heat settles. A length of rope lies near the wall, cut from something larger, and it has the heavy, used look of a line that has known strain around a bollard. The outer fibers are polished and dark from handling, while the inner twist shows a duller brown where yesterday's cut exposed the heart. You lift it and feel its weight across both palms, and the small ache in your fingers from the previous day returns like an old acquaintance, not unwelcome, simply known. To open such a rope, you begin at the end, where the strands show themselves most plainly, and you persuade them apart with the spike. It is a slow release, because each strand has been laid against the others with intention, turned and tightened until many separate fibers could behave as one strong thing. Now your work asks them to become separate again, not broken, not wasted, but loosened into a softer life, and there is a quiet mercy in that reversal. The rope scratches against the bench as you turn it, and the sound is low, dry, and close to the ear. A little black dust falls from the old tar, gathering in the seams of the wood and along the folds of your apron, and the smell grows stronger as the inner fibers are exposed. You pull, roll, and draw out a tuft, then another, while the morning outside thickens with passing voices and the slight metallic ring of a pail being set down on stone. There are men who work by sight first, and men who work by rule, but a caulker learns to trust the pads of the fingers. Touch tells you when fiber is still too long and rope-like, when it has become good oakum, and when it has weakened into dust that should not be hidden in a seam. You rub a little between thumb and forefinger, and the material answers with its own small language, rough, springing tarred, and ready enough for the day's use. The harbour beyond the workshop is full of preparations that are larger than yours, but not more necessary in their own way. A vessel may be taking aboard water, another may be waiting for orders, and another may be half open to repair, its deckboards lifted, and its seams exposed to light. Men cross the yard with planks on their shoulders, clerks pass with papers held close against the wind, and you sit among these movements like the centre of a slow wheel, making the fibre that will disappear into the work of others. By mid-morning, a carpenter comes in with shaving still clinging to one sleeve, and he asks for enough oakum for a narrow run along a deck. He holds his hands apart to show the length, though both of you know that the seam itself will decide how much it truly wants. You give him a small bundle and he weighs it once in his hand before leaving, and that gesture, simple as it is, shows the shared understanding of men who measure many things by feel. The shop grows warmer as the sun enters the lane, and the smell of the rope begins to seem less sharp, as if your senses have made room for it. Now and then you wipe your hands on a rag, though the rag only moves the tar around after a while, darkening with each pass until it looks as seasoned as the tools. This is how the place keeps a record of work, not in writing alone, but in stains, worn edges, polished handles, and the countless little deposits of days that never announce themselves. When a new coil is brought in, fresher and paler than the old harbour rope, it is not for picking apart, and you look at it almost as a different creature. New rope has a tighter confidence, a cleaner plant smell beneath its dressing, and the strands sit together with the firm neatness of something not yet humbled by weather. It reminds you that every worn length once began like that, straight from the rope walk or store, full of use yet to come, before salt, sun, and human hands gave it history. The making of rope itself is a patient art, and although your work lies at the end of its service, you know enough to respect its beginning. Fibers must be cleaned, dressed, combed, twisted, and laid, and the strength of the finished line depends on repeated turns held in balance, neither too slack nor too harsh. In the long rope walk, a man may step backward for many yards while the twisting continues, and the rope forms between workers like a path drawn out of fibre and motion. You have seen such work, perhaps not every day, but often enough to carry the image in your mind while you undo what others have made. There is no insult in that undoing, because the rope has already lived its first purpose, and the caulker's bench is not a place of destruction so much as conversion. What was once a line for hauling, mooring, lifting, or securing now becomes a filling for seams, and the harbour loses nothing, because the material remains within its circle of use. A small boat may come in during the day with water in her bilge, and the owner may say she has been taking more than she should. Not urgently, just enough to trouble him. These are common words, spoken without drama, because every boat has needs, and every working man knows the difference between inconvenience and real alarm. You go to look when called, bringing an iron mallet and oakum, and the boat lies low beside the quay, smelling of fish, wet rope, sun-warmed planking, and the faint sourness of water that has sat too long inside wood. The seam in question may not look like much from above, only a narrow, dark line where two planks meet. But your hand can read the looseness in it. You press gently, scrape away what has failed, and find the place where old caulking has tired, shrunk, or broken under years of movement. Nothing in a boat stays still forever. Not wood, not pitch, not the lines that hold it, and the repair is less a correction than an answer to the natural changing of things. You set a little oakum against the opening and press it in with the iron, giving the first taps with almost more listening than force. The mallet's sound changes when the fibre takes hold, and the seam seems to close around the new material, as if remembering what it was meant to do. You continue along the line, adding only what is needed, and the work becomes a slow sewing of the hull, a joining without needle or thread, made by pressure, judgment, and repetition. The owner stands in the boat at times, then on the quay, then back again, shifting as people do when the work concerns them but does not belong to their own hands. He may tell you that his father used the same boat, or that a cousin helped replace a plank some seasons ago, and you listen with one part of the mind while the rest stays with the seam. Boats carry families as well as cargo, even when they are plain and patched, and each repair touches more than the visible wood. You do not hurry the final part, because the short section near a fastening can be awkward, and a careless blow may damage the edge. The iron must be angled slightly, the fibre thinned, the mallet lifted less high, and the seam filled with enough steadiness to make the small places sound as the open run beside it. These adjustments would be hard to explain fully to someone watching, but the body makes them almost without speech, drawing on years of practice stored in the wrist. After the oakum is set, the sealing begins, and the dark covering smooths the repair into a continuous line. The pitch shines at first, reflecting the light in a narrow glimmer, then dulls as it cools and settles against the plank. You scrape away a small excess, wipe the iron, and look once more along the seam, not proudly, exactly, but with the quiet wish that no water should find fault with it. The harbour, meanwhile, continues around you, indifferent in the kind way of places that have held many generations of work. A launch crosses the basin, leaving a small wake that lifts and lowers the boats against their lines, and the water slaps softly where stone steps descend into green shade. Overhead, the sky has cleared to a hard blue, and the white walls around the harbour seem to give the light back twice, so that even shadows have a warm brightness at their edges. When the job is finished, you carry the tools back, and the mallet knocks lightly against your leg with each step. The handle is smooth where your hand has held it, but rough near the head, where dents and old marks show the accidents of other days. You may have repaired that handle once, shaving it down a little or tightening the head, and now the tool feels like a small, stubborn companion, simple and faithful in a way that more complicated things rarely are. Back in the workshop, you return to the bench with the steady relief of work that changes posture. Kneeling gives way to sitting, striking gives way to picking, and the body settles into another kind of effort, one that asks more of the fingers than the shoulders. The rope you left earlier is waiting with its loosened end open, and you take it up again, finding the place where the morning stopped as naturally as resuming a half-remembered prayer. This return to the same task is one of the deep comforts of repetitive work, though it may not be spoken of in such words. A person can enter and leave the motion many times in a day, and each return carries a small sense of belonging because the material waits without judgment. The rope does not ask where your thoughts have been, and the bench does not ask whether your morning went well. They simply receive your hands and continue the day. There are days when the yard is busier than usual, and voices arrive from every direction with orders, jokes, complaints, and the plain calls of men moving heavy things. On those days, your quiet corner may seem almost sheltered from the wider labour, yet the oakum you prepare is being taken away steadily, bundle by bundle, into jobs you may never see finished. This gives the work a hidden reach, and while you sit with the old rope, your hands are already present in several vessels at once, tucked into seams and covered over. Sometimes you work beside a man older than you, one whose hands have thickened into the shape of the trade over many decades. He may speak of earlier years, when certain yards were smaller, when particular ships came often, or when a foreman now long gone kept stricter order than the present one. His stories are not told like performances. They arrive in pieces between motions, and because neither of you needs to look directly at the other, the past enters the room gently, without asking anyone to stop working. He might remember caulking under canvas in rain, or preparing oakum by lamplight during a rush before a vessel's departure, or the feel of a rope so tarred and hardened that it fought every finger. He might remember wages, storms, names, feast days, and the taste of coffee bought from a man who carried it through the yard in a tin container. These details settle into your own memory as if they had always belonged there. And in this way, the trade hands down not only methods, but a whole weather of living. The younger men, when they listen, catch some of it, though they may not yet know which parts matter. They may remember the funny remark, the complaint about a foreman, or the mention of a ship with an impressive name, but later, after years of work, another part of the story may rise in them unexpectedly. A sentence about keeping oakum dry, a warning about striking too hard, or a description of how pitch behaves in cold weather may return precisely when it is needed. The working day is full of such quiet inheritances, passed along not as lessons in a book, but as habits embedded in movement. You learn where to stand so the light helps you, how to set a tool down without losing it, how to carry hot pitch without splashing, and how to stop before tiredness makes the hands clumsy. These things do not seem grand while they are being learned, yet they are the difference between rough labor and craft. Outside the shop, the island afternoon leans toward heat again, and the street sounds grow thinner for a while. A cat slips along the wall, pausing where shade meets sun, and a woman carrying a basket passes the doorway with her eyes turned toward the ground. You notice these things with the side of your attention, as workers do, letting them pass through the mind without becoming distractions, while the rope slowly gives itself up. There is salt in nearly everything by the harbour, not always visible, but present in the way metal blooms, cloth stiffens, and wood takes on a faint crust at its edges. Your skin tastes of it when you wipe your lip, and old rope often holds it deep inside, mingled with tar and grit. Salt preserves and damages in the same breath, and much of maritime work is simply the long, patient management of that double nature, accepting the sea's gifts while answering its wear. The oakum, too, carries salt, and perhaps that is why it seems so proper inside a seam, because it is already acquainted with water. When driven into wood and covered well, it swells slightly where damp reaches it, tightening the place it fills and making itself more useful by its own response. There is a gentle wisdom in materials that behave this way, and the caulker's art is partly knowing how to place them where their natural tendencies become helpful. If the day includes work on a deck, you climb aboard with the careful balance of someone used to surfaces that may shift underfoot. Deck seams differ from hull seams in their exposure to sun, footsteps, and washing, and they often hold the smell of daily life aboard a vessel. You kneel near a line between planks where old compound has cracked or loosened, and the deck feels warm through your trousers, holding the noon sun even as the air begins slowly to move. A deck receives every kind of human passage: boots, bare feet, drop tools, water buckets, cargo, coiled blinds, and the small accidents of meals taken in haste. Its seams must be tight enough to shed water and steady enough to endure use, yet flexible enough to accept the movement of the planks beneath all that traffic. As you clean and refill the line, you feel that you are tending not only the vessel's structure, but the floor of another working life. From the deck, the harbour appears wider, and the buildings across the water seem arranged in layers of stone and shadow. Laundry moves from balconies, bells travel from churches, and smoke from a funnel lowers itself across the light before thinning into the sky. For a moment, while you reach for more oakum, you see the place as a visitor might see it, beautiful and ancient, though the impression passes quickly because the seam beneath your hand asks for its next careful tap. The mallet resumes, and the sound travels through the deck into the vessel's hollow body. Each blow is small, but the hull receives it, and you can feel a faint answering resonance through your knees and hand. It is not loud enough to disturb the harbour, only enough to remind you that a boat is a chamber of wood, air, fastenings, and memory, and that every repair speaks through the whole body before becoming still. When men work nearby, their rhythms join yours imperfectly, as rhythms in real workplaces always do. A saw begins in long strokes, then stops while the plank is shifted. A hammer answers with brisker blows, a brush works almost silently, spreading paint along a rail, and your mallet keeps its quieter, more inward beat. The combined sound has no conductor, but the ear accepts it as belonging together, and after a while, its irregularity becomes soothing, because it is the sound of many people doing what they know. In the late afternoon, the fresh caulking on the deck begins to cool, and dust tries to settle before it has fully lost its tack. You guard the seam a little, not with ceremony, but by placing tools or a plank nearby, so that passing feet understand without a word. A worker learns many such small signals, and in a crowded yard, half of cooperation lies in noticing what another person's materials are not yet ready to endure. When you return to the quay, the sun has moved low enough that the water is broken into bright pieces. They flicker under the hulls and along the stone, making every wet surface seem briefly alive, though nothing has changed except the angle of light. You rinse a tool, wipe it, and feel the cooling iron in your hand, grateful for the simple sensation after hours of tar, wood, and warmth. There is still rope to prepare before the day closes, and so you sit once more with the old length across your knees. The end is now frayed like an old brush, and the fibers separate more readily, perhaps because your hands have found the rope's habits. As the room cools, the work becomes easier to bear, and you hear more of the smaller sounds again. A pigeon on the roof, a distant wheel, a man coughing softly in the lane. A person might imagine that repetitive work empties the mind, but often it makes room for subtler thoughts that would be crowded out by hurry. You remember the first seam you trusted yourself to finish, the first time an older man said nothing afterward, which was praise enough, and the first day you came home with hands so sore that sleep felt like sinking into warm sand. These memories do not arrive sharply. They drift among the fibers, appearing and disappearing as the rope opens. The craft has never made you rich, and it has not placed your name on a plaque or in a story told by strangers. Still, it has given the days a structure, and it has tied your labor to water, wood, weather, and the movement of ships in and out of harbour. There is meaning in such ties, even when it remains unspoken, because a person may live quite deeply inside work that others pass without noticing. As the evening lamps come on, the last bundle of oakum is set aside, and the rope has been reduced to a shorter, looser remainder. You sweep the bench with your hand, then with a small brush, gathering fibers that cling stubbornly to cracks in the wood. The shop smells of the day in layers. Fresh oakum, old tar, warm dust, damp rope, and the faint trace of coffee that someone spilled near the door hours earlier. The tools are put away slowly, each one returning to the place where tomorrow's hand will seek it. The iron rests with other irons, the mallet lies close by, the spike is set where it will not roll, and the rag hangs dark and stiff over a nail. In that arrangement there is no decoration, yet it has the calm beauty of usefulness, because everything rests according to the shape of the work it serves. Outside, the harbour is entering its blue hour, when details soften but outlines remain clear. Masts draw fine dark lines against the sky, hulls become broader shadows, and the water gathers the last colour from the west before giving itself over to lamps. You pause at the doorway for only a moment, breathing the cooler air, and the day feels complete, not because everything is finished forever, but because today's portion has been given. The repaired boat sits quiet near the quay, and by morning she may be afloat again, her seams hidden under paint, water, and use. No one passing her will think of the old rope in the workshop, or the tar under your nail, or the careful tapping along the plank. That is all right, because the work was never meant to remain visible, and its success lies precisely in the fact that the boat can go about her business without drawing attention to the places that were tended. You walk away with the slow step of a tired man who is not defeated by tiredness. The streets receive you with their evening sounds, plates, voices, shutters, a door closing, a child repeating a phrase from somewhere above, and the faint echo of the harbour following behind. Your hands hang at your sides, rough and darkened, and although they are empty now, they still remember the shape of the rope. Later, as the town settles and the air cools over the stone, the yard grows still in its own working fashion. It is never silent in the complete sense, because water moves, lines creak, and distant vessels keep their small noises through the night. But the human labour has withdrawn for a while. Benches, tools, coils and boats remain under the dimness, each one holding the imprint of use, and each one ready to receive the morning without surprise. The Oakum waits in its crate, loose and dark, made from old strength and prepared for hidden service. The seams already filled hold their quiet pressure, wood against fibre, fibre under pitch, pitch under air, and beneath it all the patient nearness of the sea. Nothing speaks of completion, and yet the harbour rests in 1,000 small completed acts, every one of them ordinary, every one of them enough for the night. Before dawn has fully loosened the night, a dampness rests on the stones near the water, and the harbour sounds smaller than it will later, as if each noise is wrapped in cloth. You arrive while the sky is still pale at the edges, carrying the simple things of the day, and the smell of last evening's tar greets you before your eyes have adjusted to the room. The bench is there, the crate is there, the tools are there, and the first act is only to stand a moment inside the familiar quiet, letting the place return to you. There are mornings when the rope seems to have waited with a kind of patience equal to your own, neither asking to be finished, nor allowing itself to be forgotten. You lift the remaining coil from yesterday and set it across the bench, feeling how the cut end has dried a little in the night, and how the outer fibres have stiffened where the air touched them. A small shake frees dust from its twists, and the dust falls in a soft, dark sprinkling that reminds you how much of old work becomes powder before it becomes useful again. A caulker often begins by sorting because not every length of rope deserves the same treatment, and not every seam should receive the same fibre. The cleaner, stronger pieces are kept for work that must be trusted, while rougher scraps may serve for lesser filling, packing, or some task where dryness matters less. You do not think of this as waste or thrift in grand terms, but simply as proper use, because material has character, and a working hand must learn to match that character to the need before it. The shop smells different according to what lies nearest the door, and today it is the smell of a newly opened bale, mingling with older, darker rope. The fresh hemp has a faint field smell beneath the dust, dry and grassy, while the used rope smells of tar, seawater, and the long handling of men who have hauled it, coiled it, cursed it, trusted it, and let it go. You stand between these two ages of fibre, one still tight with possibility, and one softened by service, and your work belongs mostly to the second life. Outside, the first carts move toward the harbour, and their wheels take the uneven road with the old rising and falling music of wood, iron, and stone. A man calls to his mule in a low voice, almost kindly, and a shutter opens above the lane with a scrape that sounds larger in the morning than it will at noon. You sit again, bend toward the rope, and the world narrows to the place where your fingers find the twist, because every day, no matter how broad the harbour is, begins at one end. The rope gives slowly, especially where tar has sunk deep between the yarns, and you work the point of the spike into a dark groove without forcing it. Once a strand rises, you catch it between finger and thumb, draw it back, and feel the hidden fibres pull against one another with that small friction that seems almost alive. It is not alive, of course, but it came from living plants and human labour, and perhaps that is why the material never feels entirely mute beneath the hands. There is an old habit of saving the best light for the most careful seeing, and so you turn slightly when the sun begins to enter the doorway. The light falls across the bench and shows the rope's ridges, the small grains of sand caught in tar, the pale split ends where fibres have broken, and the darker places where old strain has polished the surface. What the eye sees, the hand confirms, and together they guide the day's first bundle into shape, loose enough to breathe and tight enough to serve. When a bundle is ready, you place it beside the others and give it a light press, feeling how it springs back. Good oakum should not lie dead in the palm, and it should not crumble at the touch, because it must answer the seam as the seam answers the sea. You roll a length between your hands, making a rough cord that will be easy to feed under an iron, and the blackened fibres leave thin marks along the lines of your skin. A younger worker comes in, rubbing sleep from his face, and he greets the room more than any one person, as people do when a place itself feels like company. He takes his place nearby and reaches for a rope end, and for a while the two of you work without speaking, sharing the slight rasp of fibre and the occasional knock of a tool against wood. His motions, are better than they were last month, less eager and more steady. And although you do not praise him aloud, you notice the improvement with the quiet satisfaction of seeing a craft settle into another pair of hands. Teaching in the yard is rarely formal, and much of it happens through correction that is so small it might pass unnoticed from the outside. You may move his hand a little lower on the rope, show him how to turn the strand before pulling, or tell him to keep the longer fibers apart from the brittle dust. He nods, tries again, and the rope opens more cleanly, and in that small success there is a gentle continuity, the trade passing forward without ceremony. By the time the sun reaches the opposite wall, a call comes from the slip where a boat has been hauled for fuller repair. You gather oakum, 2 irons, the mallet, a rag, and a tin that will later hold warmed pitch, placing each thing in a manner that makes carrying possible without haste. The younger man follows with the bundle, and together you walk through the yard, past stacked boards, coiled lines, a cart of scrap timber, and men already marked with dust, paint, oil or soot. The boat on the slip is broader than yesterday's, and her lower planks show the greenish memory of water where weed and harbour growth have been scraped away. She has been cleaned roughly, and the smell beneath her is strong, salt, mud, fish, damp wood, and that faint iron tang that comes from fastenings exposed to the air. You duck into the shadow under her side, and the daylight becomes a striped thing, broken by supports, planks, knees, and the leaning figures of workers moving around you. The seam to be opened runs along a curve, and curved work asks the body to make many small adjustments that straight work does not demand. You kneel, lean, shift, and find a place for the left hand while the right sets the iron, and the oakum must be fed along a line that never quite stays at the same angle. The apprentice watches closely, holding the bundle, and you let him see that the curve is not an enemy of the work, only a shape asking for a different patience. Old caulking is removed where it has failed, and the material comes out in dark fragments, some dry and hard, some damp and stringy where water has reached it. You use the point carefully, lifting what should go and leaving what still holds, because repair is not always a full undoing. Often it is a conversation between old work and new, a way of strengthening what remains rather than pretending that every seam begins fresh under your hand. The sound under the hull is enclosed, and each tap comes back with a wooden closeness that seems to belong inside the chest. Above you, someone walks along the planks, and the boat answers with a low creak, not troubling, simply the voice of weight passing through timber. You feed the first length of oakum into the seam, set it with light blows, and feel the line begin to accept the fibre, drawing it inward until the surface is ready for the next pass. In this part of the job, the mallet must be firm but not proud, because wood remembers roughness. A blow too hard can crush an edge or drive the material unevenly, while a blow too light leaves the seam hungry and uncertain. So the hand finds the middle again and again, and after many years that middle feels less like a decision than a kindness, a measured way of giving the material what it needs, and no more. The younger worker tries a short stretch under your eye, and his first taps are cautious, then too strong, then closer to what the seam requires. You correct him with a few words, not harshly, because the lesson is already in the sound, and when the note changes, he hears it. His shoulders loosen a little, the rhythm settles, and for several minutes he works well enough that you can prepare the next length while listening, letting the seam itself teach him the rest. From outside the shadow comes the brighter life of the yard, voices crossing in Maltese and English, a chain dragging, a saw biting into timber, and a gull complaining above the quay. These sounds are not interruptions. They are the air through which the work moves, and the caulker learns to hear them, as a person hears the household while mending near a window. Nothing is entirely separate in a harbour, because the smallest task is surrounded by cargo, weather, orders, meals, repairs, and the breathing presence of the sea. When the curve is finished, you sit back on your heels and feel the old stiffness of knees that have spent too long against wood and stone. The younger man shifts beside you, wiping his hands on his trousers, and both of you look along the seam without speaking for a moment. It is a narrow, dark line, no more impressive than a shadow, yet you know the labour inside it, fibre pressed under pressure, judgment hidden under pitch, and a little future dryness prepared in advance. The heating pot is brought closer, and the pitch begins to soften over a careful flame, releasing its deep, smoky scent into the hollow under the boat. You watch the surface change, thick shine becoming movement, and you stir slowly so the warmth travels through the mass without scorching it. There is almost a kitchen patience to this part, though the smell is harsher and the meal is for wood rather than people. And the same rule applies, that heat must be watched if it is to serve kindly. The pitch is laid over the seam in a steady line, not hurried, not lavish, and not so thin that the oakum would be left too close to weather. It glistens in the shadow and then dulls, darkening the repair until it looks older than it is. You clean the edge, scrape what has spread too far, and leave behind the kind of work that most people will never admire because it has chosen usefulness over display. When you stand, the world outside seems brighter for a few seconds, and the harbour air touches your face like a cloth lifted from cool water. The sun is high now, and the limestone walls are giving back heat, while the masts and rigging make fine, dark lines against the glare. You carry the tools toward the shade, and the mallet handle feels warm where your palm has held it, as though the work has entered the wood and stayed there. At midday, the yard loosens its grip. Men find walls, doorways, steps, and pieces of timber where they can sit, and food appears from cloth parcels with the homely seriousness that food has after labor. You sit with the younger worker and an older carpenter, breaking bread, dipping it into oil, eating olives one by one, and listening while the carpenter describes a plank that twisted more stubbornly than expected that morning. The conversation moves gently, touching work, weather, a cousin's news, the price of flour, and the question of whether the wind will turn before evening. No subject holds the table for long, because everyone is tired, and because the shade itself seems to ask for slower speech. The harbour continues beyond the meal, bright and restless, but for a little while your hands are still, and that stillness has its own taste, made from bread, salt, oil, and relief. After lunch you return to the workshop rather than the slip, because there is more old rope to prepare, and the afternoon heat makes seated work sensible. The room has warmed, but it is gentler than the open yard, and the shadows along the lower wall remain cool enough to rest the eyes. You lower yourself to the bench with care, pick up a new length, and begin again, letting the repeated motion carry you away from the sharper brightness outside. This rope is different, lighter in tar and easier in the twist, and it opens with a dry, fibrous sigh. It may have served in a smaller boat, perhaps as a sheet or a line handled often by bare hands, and its surface has a softer polish than the harbour mooring line from the morning. You draw out the fibres and find them longer, cleaner, more willing, and the oakum that gathers from it has a lighter colour under the dark dust, almost golden where the sun touches it. The apprentice notices the difference and asks whether it is better, and the question is simple enough to deserve a careful answer. Better depends on the seam, you tell him, or words very near to that, because coarse oakum may suit a wider place, while finer fibre may lie more sweetly in a narrow one. He turns the thought over while his hands continue, and perhaps this is how craft grows, not in rules that cover everything, but in small comparisons stored quietly until needed. Afternoon stretches longer than morning, not in clock time but in feeling, especially when the heat presses on the lane and voices fall away. You hear insects, the dull thud of distant work, the occasional ring of metal, and the slow sweep of your own breathing as the rope moves across your lap. The day enters a deep middle, and the body seems to work partly by memory, while the mind rests in the soft procession of fibres coming loose. There is a small window high in the wall, and through it a strip of light shifts across a row of hanging tools. The iron heads brighten one by one, then pass back into shade. And you notice the movement because repetitive work makes a person attentive to very slow changes. Light, smell, weight, sound, the dryness of the rope, the tackiness of tar, the amount of oakum in the crate, all become parts of the same quiet measurement. A clerk from the stores comes by with a note about materials, and his clean cuffs look almost foreign in the workshop. He asks a question, receives an answer, and writes something down, while his eyes move briefly over the coils, the darkened rag, the bench, and your hands. He is not unkind, only from another part of the system where work is held in lines of ink rather than in calluses. And when he leaves, the room returns to its rougher language without resentment. You have signed for materials before or marked a paper when asked, but the most truthful accounts of the caulker's day are not always the ones kept in offices. There is the crate fuller by a certain amount, the seam darker by a certain length, the tool head worn by another 100 soft blows, and the body more tired by an honest measure. These accounts do not balance in columns, yet they are exact enough for the world of hands. In the harbour, ships come and go under names that may outlast the men who repair them, but the daily work feels less concerned with names than with conditions. A vessel is dry or damp, ready or waiting, sound or asking for attention, and her identity matters most to those who sail, own, command, or remember her. To the caulker, she is also planks, seams, pitch, curves, gaps, and the hidden places where water may try its luck. This way of seeing does not make the world smaller. If anything, it makes it more intimate, because every object reveals itself through use, and every surface has a history of being touched, strained, worn, and repaired. A painted hull is beautiful from across the harbour, but up close it is also a record of swelling wood, scraped paint, patched seams, old fastenings, and the steady labour of people whose names may never be spoken beyond their own streets. Late in the afternoon, a breeze begins to move through the doorway, lifting the edge of a loose fibre and making it tremble on the bench. The air has changed, and with it the smell of the room changes too, losing some of its heaviness and gaining a faint coolness from the water. You look up only briefly, then return to the rope, but the body receives the breeze with gratitude, and the last part of the working day becomes easier because of that small mercy. The apprentice has made a fair pile now, uneven but useful, and you show him how to gather it without crushing the spring from it. He wants to press it tightly into a neat bundle, as many beginners do, but neatness is not always the same as readiness. You loosen what he has made, fluffing it slightly, and he laughs under his breath at himself, not embarrassed for long because the correction is practical and the material has forgiven him already. As shadows lengthen, more men pass the door on their way to finish one last thing before stopping. Some carry tools, some carry nothing but weariness, and some pause to ask whether Oakum is ready for morning. You answer, point, nod, or lift a bundle, and the room becomes briefly busy with departures, requests, and the small exchanges that close a working day without making a formal ending of it. One man brings a strip of old line too tarred and hard for his use, asking if anything can be made of it. You take it, bend it, test the outer strand with your thumb, and decide that some part of it may still serve, though perhaps not for a demanding seam. He leaves it by the wall, and there it joins the other remnants, waiting for the slower judgment of another morning, because even a doubtful piece deserves one calm inspection before being refused. The sun lowers beyond the buildings, and the workshop begins to gather blue shadow in its corners. The crate of oakum is covered lightly, the cleaner fibres kept from damp and careless feet, while the poorer scraps are separated so they do not confuse tomorrow's hand. You wipe the spike, set the iron straight, and rub the mallet handle once with the rag, less to clean it than to remove the day's last tacky place. There is a sweetness in this putting away, not sentimental, but steady and bodily. After hours of opening, pressing, striking, and sorting, the act of ordering the tools feels like smoothing a blanket over the day. You know that disorder left tonight would become friction in the morning, and so the evening hand cares for the morning hand, quietly, practically, without needing to call it kindness. When you step outside, the harbour lies in that softer light that makes stone seem older and water seem deeper. The boats on the slips are still, the moored vessels move only slightly, and the lines between bollards and decks hold a faint tension like sleeping muscles. Somewhere a pot lid sounds from a house above the yard, and the ordinary domestic world leans down toward the harbour, reminding you that every trade ends, eventually, in supper, washing, conversation, and rest. The apprentice walks beside you for part of the way, still smelling faintly of rope, and he asks something about tomorrow's boat. You answer in a few unhurried words, explaining that the seam must be checked after the pitch cools fully, and that the weather will decide how early the next work should begin. He nods, looking older than he did in the morning and younger than he thinks he is. And then he turns toward another street, carrying his tiredness home like a small parcel. Your own road rises through limestone walls, where the evening light touches the edges of balconies and leaves the lanes below in cool shadow. The day's work remains in your hands, but the town slowly replaces the yard around you, offering smells of cooking, damp stone, oil lamps, and cloth brought in from lines. Children pass close, a neighbor lifts his chin in greeting, and the harbor's rough sounds fade into a lower distance, though they never disappear entirely. At home, washing takes time, because tar prefers to stay and the fibers have settled into cuffs, nails, and the rough folds of skin. You rub soap into the palms, rinse, rub again, and watch the water carry away blackened threads and dust in small cloudy swirls. Some marks remain, and you accept them, because work that has entered the hand through years cannot be removed by one basin of water, and perhaps it shouldn't be. Evening food tastes plain and good, and the body receives it without the restless thoughts that might trouble a quieter occupation. You eat slowly, aware of the muscles in your forearms, the tenderness in the fingers, the warmth of the room, and the ease that comes when no tool needs lifting for a while. If someone asks about the day, you may mention the boat on the slip, the apprentice's progress, or the stubborn rope left by the wall, and these few details are enough to let the household know where your hours have gone. Later, when lamps are lowered and the street is thinned to occasional footsteps, the mind may return once more to the curve of the seam under the hull. It does not return anxiously but gently, almost as one might remember a line of music, the angle of the iron, the changing note of the mallet, the dark pitch cooling into place. You trust the work as much as work can be trusted, and the thought loosens, drifting away from the harbour toward sleep. In the yard, night has settled into the open boats and along the stacked timber, gathering around the tools behind closed doors. The old rope left by the wall waits in its own darkness, hard on the outside, perhaps still useful within, like many things that need time and a patient hand before they can be understood. The oakum in the crate lies light and quiet, full of air, full of old service, ready to be pressed into the unseen lines where tomorrow's water might otherwise enter. The harbour water lifts and lowers against the quay, touching stone with the same calm persistence it had in the morning. Lines creak, a vessel answers softly, and somewhere a lamp trembles in a small wind, making a narrow path of light across the dark surface. Everything rests, but nothing is lost, because the tools know their places, the seams hold their fibre, and the work of the day remains hidden where it was meant to be, doing its quiet duty through the night. By the time the first workmen return, the night damp has settled into the loose dust on the floor, and the shop feels cooler than the street outside. You open the door, and the room receives the morning in a slow, widening band, touching the bench first, then the crate, then the dark coil left by the wall. The doubtful rope is waiting where it was placed, stiff and almost black, and you look at it with the mild patience due to things that have earned a closer examination. It is not handsome rope, and it would not be trusted for lifting, hauling, or holding a vessel against a quay in a hard wind. The outer strands are glazed with old tar and grit, and the whole length bends reluctantly, as though it has forgotten how to be flexible. Still, when you cut away a hardened end and open it with the spike, the inside shows a little strength, not enough for everything, but enough for some seam that needs filling where the strain will be modest and the shelter good. This is how much of the work begins, not with certainty, but with judgment that grows from touch. You separate the poor fibre from the better fibre, letting the brittle dust fall aside while the longer strands gather in your palm. A younger man might have thrown the whole piece away, and perhaps not been entirely wrong. Yet the old habit of the harbour is to ask one more question of material before surrendering it to uselessness. The rope resists, so you work more slowly than usual, bending a short section back and forth until the tar cracks and the fibres loosen. Each little opening has to be earned, and the spike must enter at an angle, finding the hidden line between strands rather than forcing a path through them. It is almost like opening a shell without breaking what is inside, and though the result is not fine oakum, it has a coarse usefulness that will do for certain rougher jobs. Outside, the harbour is beginning its louder hours, with calls moving over the water and carts arriving from the upper streets. The first warmth of the day touches the lintel, and a smell of damp rope drying in the sun comes from somewhere beyond the yard, mingling with smoke, bread, and the salt edge of the morning air. You keep your place at the bench, sorting and pulling, because the day's larger movements depend on many small preparations that must be made before anyone asks too sharply for them. A messenger from one of the slips comes with word that a small launch needs attention along her deck seams. Not urgent, but better done before another week of washing and foot traffic. You put aside the coarse fibre and gather cleaner oakum, choosing material with a better spring, because deck work is more exposed and less forgiving of careless preparation. The bundle is wrapped in cloth, the irons are taken from their hooks, and the mallet, already familiar in the hand, comes along with its old weight. The launch sits close to the quay, painted in a colour that has faded under sun and spray, and her deck holds the dust of many crossings. She has carried officers, workers, messages, parcels, and perhaps 100 small errands that never appear in histories of harbours, though without such errands the larger machinery of work would slow and stumble. You step aboard carefully, feeling the boat shift under you, and for a moment the movement rises through the legs, reminding you that even tied vessels retain a little freedom. Deck seams have their own smell, different from seams along the lower hull, because they have known sun, boots, spilled water, oil from machinery, and the ordinary dirt of use. Old compound lifts under the edge of the tool in curled strips, and beneath it the previous oakum lies dark, flattened, and tired from years of being pressed between wood and weather. You clear only what must be cleared, keeping the sound portions where they hold, because a good repair wastes neither old work nor new material. The first new fibre is laid into the cleaned seam, and your iron follows it with a gentle discipline, pressing it down along the line between planks. The mallet strikes in a steady pattern, not loud, but close enough that anyone nearby can hear the work advancing inch by inch. Each tap asks whether the fibre has seated properly, and each answer comes through sound, resistance, and the small change in how the iron rests against the wood. A man working near the launch pauses to coil a rope, and his motion is as practiced as yours, though it belongs to another daily habit. He lays each loop neatly over the last, giving the line a shape that will not snarl when next needed, and then he places it beside a bollard with the quiet care of someone who knows confusion can be costly later. You notice it without stopping, because good order in one trade is always recognizable to another, even when the tools and purposes are different. The sun warms the deck quickly, and the planks begin to give off a dry smell beneath the tar and dust. You move a rag beneath your knee, not for comfort alone, but to keep grit from pressing into the skin, and you lean forward along the seam with the slow endurance of work that keeps the body folded. The launch rocks once when someone steps aboard aft, and your hand waits until the movement settles before the next tap falls. There is a quiet intelligence in waiting for the boat rather than fighting her. A clumsy hand would strike through the motion, but long practice teaches that wood, water, and weight must be allowed their brief say before the tool resumes. So you wait, breathe, and continue, and the delay is so small that no one else may notice it, though such small permissions are part of what makes the finished line sound. When the seam has been filled, the pitch is brought warm enough to flow, and the dark line receives its covering. The smell rises under the sun, stronger than it would in shade, and for a while the deck seems wrapped in the thick scent of repair. You smooth the surface carefully, drawing away the excess, and the fresh seam takes on a quiet gloss that will dull by evening, becoming simply part of the deck again. A little boy on the quay watches from a distance, perhaps sent with a message, perhaps only lingering because work attracts children in the way moving water does. He looks at the mallet, the iron, the shining pitch, and the dark marks on your hands, and in his face there is that serious attention children give to things they don't yet have names for. You do not speak to him at first, but when he comes closer, you tell him to keep his foot away from the fresh line, and he nods, as if entrusted with something official. By midday, the launch is left to settle, and you return to the yard with the tools wrapped loosely in a cloth. The air shimmers over stone, and men choose the shadowed sides of buildings without seeming to decide it. You pass a pile of planks, a barrel with its lid weighted by a stone, and a cat sleeping under a cart, all of them part of the same harbour noon when even necessary movement learns to become economical. Lunch comes under shade, where the wall still holds a little coolness from the night. You sit with bread, olives, and a small piece of cheese, and the taste is plain enough to match the day without demanding attention from it. Around you, workers chew, drink, talk, or close their eyes for a moment, and the harbour continues in front of everyone, wide and bright, carrying light on its surface while its deeper water remains green and private. An older caulker speaks of a time when more wooden hulls came through the yard, and his voice has the unhurried quality of someone not trying to prove the past superior. He remembers long stretches of seamwork, days when oakum seemed to vanish as quickly as it could be made, and evenings when the hand still felt the mallet long after the tool was put down. You listen because his memory has the texture of work, and because the old accounts of a trade help younger days fit themselves into a longer line. He speaks also of ships changing, of iron and steel taking more of the harbour's attention, and of wooden work remaining in smaller boats, decks, fittings and repairs that the sea still made necessary. Trades do not end all at once, he says in his own manner, though he may not use those words. They shift, narrow, remain in corners, and carry on where their knowledge is still needed. The thought settles over the meal gently, not sadly, because the bench, the rope, and the seams are still waiting in the afternoon light. When you return indoors, the shop feels close after the harbour glare, and your eyes rest gratefully on the darker wall. The coarse rope from the morning lies open on the bench, and the better fibres you have separated are waiting in a modest heap, less beautiful than the cleaner oakum but not without purpose. You work through the remainder, accepting its limits, and the task becomes a lesson in not asking a tired material to pretend it is young. The apprentice sits nearby and sorts his own pile, glancing now and then towards yours to see what you keep and what you discard. You let him compare the fibres, placing a strong tuft in one palm and a brittle one in the other, so he can feel the difference before you explain it. Words help, but touch settles deeper, and the next time he meets a poor rope, his fingers may remember what his mind would otherwise forget. The afternoon becomes a long, slow chamber of repeated sound. Fibres rasp, tools shift, a fly bumps against the high window, and outside the yard offers occasional voices that rise and fall without demanding entry. You draw the rope apart section by section, and the pile grows with a stubborn modesty, not quickly, not impressively, but enough to prove that the morning's doubtful length had not been beyond all service. In such hours, you become aware of the bench itself, its dents and cuts, its stains, the places where edges have been rounded by hands and rope. It has supported men younger than you, older than you, and perhaps men already gone, each one leaving almost nothing distinct, yet together making the wood into a record of use. The bench doesn't remember in words, but the body feels the accumulation, and sitting there becomes a way of belonging to a quiet procession. The trade has this hidden depth because every simple act carries other acts behind it. Picking oakum carries the making of rope, the growing of fibre, the loading of bales, the labour of sailors, the work of shipwrights, and the long argument between vessels and water. A person listening only for large events might miss all of it, but at the bench, with tar under the nails and fibre on the apron, the connections are close enough to touch. Late in the day, a small repair is needed on a hatch cover whose seams have opened under sun. It is not a grand job, and nobody will remember it tomorrow if it is done well, but water through a hatch can spoil cargo or make trouble below. You take a little prepared fibre, a narrow iron, and a small amount of compound, then work along the edges in the slanting light, filling the gaps where wood has shifted from heat and age. The hatch cover lies on trestles, so you can stand rather than kneel, and the change is welcome after hours at the bench. Its boards are worn smooth in the middle and rougher near the edges, with old scratches crossing one another like pale marks on skin. You clean the seams with care, brush away dust, and set the oakum in a thinner line than a hull seam would require, because every piece of work has its own scale. The apprentice watches, and then finishes a short edge under your supervision, his brow furrowed in concentration. He is learning that smaller work is not easier simply because it is smaller, and that a narrow seam may demand more restraint than a broad one. When he is done, the line is not perfect, but it will hold, and you correct only what must be corrected, leaving enough of his work intact for him to recognize it later. A quiet pride belongs to such moments, though no one names it. The teacher sees a habit forming, the learner feels a little steadier, and the object itself receives the benefit without knowing either of them. A trade survives in this modest way, not through speeches, but through repeated corrections, shared tools, and the moment when a younger hand begins to hear what the material is saying. Evening gathers with a pale gold light on the upper walls, while the lower yard falls slowly into shade. You sweep the loose fibre from the bench and gather usable scraps, because even after a day of sorting, the floor has collected small bits worth saving. The sweeping smell of dust and tar, and as you lift them into a basket, the air briefly fills with fine particles that catch the last sun before disappearing. The coarse oakum is marked by its place rather than by writing, kept separate in a corner of the crate where anyone who knows the room will understand its purpose. The cleaner bundles lie closer to the top, ready for morning work, and the very finest are covered against stray dust. It is an unwritten arrangement, but all good workshops have such arrangements, and a person who disturbs them soon learns that silence can be a form of instruction. Tools are cleaned according to need, not polished beyond sense. The irons must be free of clinging compound, the mallet must be dry enough to grip, and the spike must not carry hardened tar into tomorrow's rope. You work the rag over each surface, and the slow cleaning has the restful quality of a second, gentler task after the main labour has been completed. When the foreman passes the doorway, he looks in and asks whether the launch is done. You say that it is, and that the pitch should be left undisturbed until morning, if possible, and he nods with the small impatience of a man holding several tasks at once. He moves on, and his footsteps fade, while you remain in the cooling room, where the finished answer to his question lies not in talk, but in the order of the tools and the emptier crate. The apprentice leaves first, carrying a message toward the upper street, and the room feels wider after his footsteps disappear. You remain a few minutes longer, setting the doubtful rope's last unusable pieces aside and covering the good fibre with cloth. This extra time is not demanded by anyone, but it makes the next morning kinder, and many working lives are softened by these small, unrecorded preparations. At the door, you turn back once, not with drama, but with the ordinary checking glance that closes the day. The bench is clear, the mallet rests where it should, the oakum is sheltered, and the old rope has been reduced to whatever usefulness it still possessed. Nothing more is needed from the room tonight, and so you pull the door closed, leaving behind the thick, warm smell of hemp, pitch, dust, and wood. The harbour at evening is less a place of work than a place holding the memory of work. Boats shift softly, cranes stand still, ropes draw shallow curves between stone and deck, and the water carries broken reflections of lamps beginning to appear along the quay. A man washes his hands at a tap, another shoulders a tool bag, and somewhere beyond the wall a woman calls down to someone in the street with a voice made gentle by distance. You walk slowly because the body is tired in several languages. The fingers speak of fibre, the knees speak of deck and hull, the shoulders speak of tools carried and held, and the soles of the feet speak of stone warmed by a long day. Yet the tiredness is not sharp. It is spread evenly, like a cloth laid over a table, and there is a peacefulness in feeling the body account for its own labour. On the way home, you pass a narrow shop where light spills onto the pavement, and for a moment the smell of soap and citrus overtakes the tar in your clothes. Then the lane turns, and cooking smells take over. Onions, oil, bread, and something simmering slowly behind a door. The town receives the harbour workers one by one, not with ceremony, but with thresholds, basins, food, and the ordinary welcome of voices that know who is late and who is early. At home, when you wash, the water finds dark lines in the skin and carries away the day in faint, cloudy threads. You scrub around the nails, rub the thumb where tar has settled deepest, and turn the hand's palm up to see what remains. Some marks stay as they always do, and after a while you dry the hands and let them be, because cleanliness has its limit and work has its own stubborn signature. The evening meal passes with low conversation, and the body's hunger gradually loosens into heaviness. You hear about household matters, small expenses, a neighbor's errand, and the weather that may come in 2 days if the wind holds as it is. The harbour is not the whole of life, but it enters the room through your clothing, your hands, and the stories you do or do not tell, and then it settles quietly among the plates. Later, when the house grows dim, the day's motions return in fragments. The deck seam on the launch, the boy watching from the quay, the old caulker speaking of wooden hulls, the apprentice pressing oakum too tightly, the doubtful rope opening at last to reveal a little serviceable fibre. None of these thoughts asks to be solved, and one by one they pass through the mind like small boats crossing dark water. Sleep comes while the harbour continues without you. The launch rests with her new seams cooling under the night air, the hatch cover lies ready to be used again, and the coarse oakum kept apart in the crate waits for some lesser duty that will still matter in its place. In the workshop, the bench holds its silence, the tools hold their shape, and the old smells gather close in the darkness, patient as always. Beyond the door, the sea works softly at the stones, repeating itself with the oldest rhythm in the harbour. It touches the quay, withdraws, returns, and withdraws again, never hurried and never finished, while vessels answer with faint creaks from their lines. The seams you filled rest hidden inside that rhythm, fibre pressed into wood, pitch guarding fibre, and the quiet labour of your hands held safely out of sight until another morning calls it back into use.